The annual Gutierrez Development Corporate Gala was exactly the kind of environment I usually paid money to avoid. It was a massive ballroom filled with crystal chandeliers, terrible acoustic jazz, and 200 empty suits pretending to understand architecture. I was 28, a landscape architect who spent his days operating heavy machinery and reading soil density reports. I belonged in the dirt, not in a rented tuxedo that felt like a canvas straitjacket. But attendance had been marked mandatory for all lead project heads. I stood near the coat check, nursing a glass of sparkling water that tasted like copper, watching the fallout of the evening. 10 minutes ago, Peter Williams, the rival vice president of commercial acquisitions, had stood on the main stage and presented his cost-saving vision for the Viridian Botanical Park. It was the largest commercial bid in the state's history. It was also, I knew for a fact, Margot Gutierrez's project. Except Peter had somehow gotten his hands on our preliminary topographical maps, stripped out all the complex, expensive environmental protections Margot and I had designed, and pitched a cheap, flattened, concrete-heavy version of the park to the board of directors. The board had applauded. Margot had walked out of the ballroom. I handed my empty glass to a passing waiter and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cold night air. The valet stand was a chaotic mess of black umbrellas, flashing taillights, and the smell of expensive exhaust mixing with freezing rain. The storm had rolled in off the coast an hour ago, turning the city streets into slick, black mirrors. I spotted her immediately. Margot Gutierrez was standing entirely alone under the far edge of the canvas awning. She was 37, my direct manager, and usually possessed the terrifying, unshakable composure of a seasoned general. Tonight, the armor was cracked. She was wearing a structured, dark emerald evening gown that looked freezing, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. She was staring at her phone screen, her jaw tight. I walked over, the heavy tread of my boots sounding out of place on the pristine concrete. The logistics company canceled the executive car service, Margot said. She didn't look up from her phone. She just stated the fact to the cold air. The flooding on I-95 backed up their entire fleet. The dispatcher said it will be a 2-hour wait for a secondary vehicle. 2 hours in a sleeveless gown in November is a medical hazard, Margot, I pointed out, my voice holding its usual dry edge. We were colleagues who spent most of our time arguing over the physics of Earth moving versus her strict aesthetic timelines. She finally looked up. The exhaustion she usually buried under layers of corporate perfection was sitting right on the surface. My feet are bleeding, Rowdy. I just watched Peter Williams publicly steal 18 months of my division's work, and the board smiled while he did it. I do not have the stamina to stand on this curb for 2 hours. A massive, dark blue Ford F-250 pulled up to the valet stand, the diesel engine idling with a low, unapologetic rumble. The valet stepped out, holding the keys delicately, as if the mud on the running boards might infect him. "That's me," I said, taking the keys and fishing a $5 bill out of my pocket. I looked back at her. The wind picked up, driving a sharp spray of freezing rain under the awning. She shivered, her shoulders rigid as she tried to suppress the physical reaction. I didn't overthink the corporate hierarchy. I didn't calculate the HR optics. I walked around to the passenger side and opened the heavy steel door. "Get in," I said. Margot hesitated for exactly 1 second. She looked at the mud on the floor mats, then at the comfortable, heated leather interior of the cab. She gathered the heavy silk hem of her gown, stepped onto the running board, and climbed up into the truck. I shut the door against the storm, walked around to the driver's side, and got behind the wheel. The interior of the truck was instantly quiet, the heavy doors sealing out the noise of the Gala and the screaming wind. The heater was already running, pushing dry, warm air into the cab. "Where to?" I asked, putting the truck in gear. She gave me an address in the northern suburbs. It was a 30-minute drive in good weather. Tonight, with the roads flooding and traffic snarled, it was going to take longer. We pulled out onto the slick asphalt. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with the events of the night. We were used to looking at blueprints together, not sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark confines of a truck cab. I focused on the road, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. "You didn't look surprised when Peter put those slides up on the screen," Margot observed quietly, staring out her window at the blurred city lights. "I wasn't," I replied bluntly. "Peter is a hack. He views landscape architecture as a spreadsheet. If you flatten a hill, it costs less than retaining it. He doesn't care about the Viridian site. He cares about his quarterly bonus." He stole our CAD files. Rowdy, she said, her voice tightening. She rubbed her left temple, a gesture I recognized from our weekly briefings as a sign of an impending migraine. He took our preliminary grading maps and handed them to a budget contractor. He submitted a formal motion to the board to adopt his value-engineered proposal, and they are going to vote yes, because his bottom line is 20% lower than ours. His bottom line is a fiction, I noted, taking a slow turn onto a flooded avenue. The heavy tires of the F-250 gripped the road effortlessly. If he builds that concrete pan he designed on the lower terrace, the site won't drain. He completely ignored the natural hydrology. The board doesn't understand hydrology, Margot countered bitterly. They understand dollars. Peter framed my design as emotional and overly artistic. He framed his as objective and lean. We hit a massive puddle, water spraying high over the hood of the truck. I kept the wheel steady. The heater blew warm air, slowly chasing the damp chill from the cab. I reached out and adjusted the passenger side vents, angling them directly toward her freezing arms without making a comment about it. I glanced over at her. The defensive posture she had held all night was slowly melting away in the warmth. She leaned her head back against the leather headrest, closing her eyes. She wasn't the terrifying VP of development right now. She was just a person carrying a ridiculous amount of unfair weight. You can recline the seat? I offered quietly. It's a long drive. She didn't open her eyes, but her hand found the lever on the side of the seat. It clicked back a few inches. The rain hammered against the roof. The rhythmic, mechanical sweep of the windshield wipers was hypnotic. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence had shifted from awkward to profoundly comfortable. It felt like we were the only two people awake in the city, insulated inside a moving fortress. I looked at the GPS on my dashboard. I knew a faster route via the interstate. It would shave 15 minutes off the trip. I looked at Margot, watching the slow, even rise and fall of her breathing as the exhaustion finally caught up with her. I didn't take the interstate. I took the long, winding road through the wooded parkway. I realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that I didn't want the drive to end. I liked the quiet. I liked the fact that she trusted me enough to let her guard down and close her eyes. In the office, she was untouchable. Here, in the dark cab of my truck, she was real. The extra 20 minutes gave her time to sleep. When I finally pulled up to the long, paved driveway of her house, the storm was still raging outside. I put the truck in park and let the engine idle. Margot, I said quietly. She stirred, opening her eyes and blinking against the dim glow of the dashboard. She sat up, the corporate armor sliding immediately back into place as she looked at her house. "Thank you for the ride, Rowdy," she said, her voice professional again. She reached for the door handle. "Wait," I said. She paused, looking back at me. "You said Peter stole our preliminary CAD files?" I stated, my mind finally connecting a massive, crucial piece of logic I had missed during the anger of the gala. "He did," she confirmed, frowning. "His presentation used the exact contour lines we mapped last month." "He used the files from last month," I repeated, a slow, cynical smile breaking across my face. "Margot, I spent the last 2 weeks on the site running deep core soil drills. I didn't upload that data to the main server yet because the IT department's formatting rules are a nightmare." Her eyes widened slightly, the exhaustion vanishing, replaced by razor-sharp intelligence. "What did you find in the deep core drills?" "There's a massive, solid granite shelf sitting exactly 12 feet below the topsoil on the southern quadrant," I told her, my voice dropping. "It's completely impermeable. It doesn't show up on standard ground-penetrating radar. Peter's value-engineered design involves digging retention trenches exactly 14 feet deep in that quadrant." Margot stared at me, doing the spatial math in her head. "If he digs his trenches there, he hits solid rock," I finished. "He won't be able to excavate without millions of dollars in blasting permits, which he didn't budget for. And if he just leaves the trenches shallow, the first major storm will overflow the system because the granite won't absorb a single drop of water. His design won't just fail, Margot. It will turn the Viridian Megapark into a 100-acre swamp." The silence in the truck was absolute. The sound of the rain faded into the background. "He doesn't know about the rock," she whispered. "He doesn't know," I confirmed. "Because he builds from a spreadsheet in a high-rise. He didn't put his boots in the dirt." Margot looked at her front door, then looked back at me. The board votes on the final contract award on Monday morning. We have 48 hours. We can't just tell them about the rock, I warned her. Peter will spin it. He'll say we're lying, or he'll claim he can fix it easily. He's a master at boardroom rhetoric. Then we don't tell them, Margot said, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous light. We show them. Come inside. I parked the truck and followed her through the rain into her house. Her home office was as structured as her mind. Bookshelves lined the walls. A massive drafting table sat in the center, and a commercial espresso machine hummed in the corner. She didn't bother changing out of her evening gown. She kicked off her heels, leaving them abandoned by the door, and immediately booted up her workstation. We need a physical model, she said, pulling up our original, complex blueprints. A cross-section of the southern quadrant. We need to prove the hydraulic failure so undeniably that even the chairman can understand it. I have the core samples in my workshop, I said, pulling out my phone. I can build a scaled, glass-encased soil profile. Real dirt, real granite, real water flow. But it takes time. We have the weekend, Margot said, turning to look at me. I'll draft the financial analysis. I'll calculate exactly how much Peter's blasting permits will cost and the exact insurance liability of a flooded site. You build the bomb. I'll write the detonator. It was a perfect division of labor. We were a team. At 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, I was standing in the pouring rain at the Viridian site. I had driven my F-250 to the equipment yard, fired up a tracked geotechnical drill rig, and spent 3 hours pulling pristine, unbroken cylinders of solid granite from the earth. I needed the board to see the physical stone. I needed them to feel the weight of Peter Williams' mistake. By noon, I had transported the heavy stone cores and bags of graded soil back to my personal workshop on the edge of the city. Margot arrived at 1 p.m. She had traded the evening gown for a thick wool sweater, jeans, and work boots. She carried 2 massive coffees and a heavy leather briefcase. She didn't complain about the smell of diesel or sawdust in my shop. She cleared a space on my workbench, set up her laptop, and went to work. For the next 12 hours, we existed in a state of absolute, synchronized focus. I built a 4-foot-long acrylic tank. I painstakingly layered the actual soil from the site, compacting it to the exact specifications of the terrain. I placed the solid granite core samples precisely where the subterranean shelf existed. Then, I carved out the drainage trenches according to Peter Williams' stolen design. Margot worked the numbers. She pulled historical weather data, calculated runoff volumes per square foot, and cross-referenced city blasting codes. At midnight, the temperature in the workshop dropped. The ancient radiator in the corner sputtered and died. I watched Margot rub her arms, her focus entirely on her screen. I put down my trowel, walked over to the radiator, and bled the air valve with a wrench until the hot water rushed back in, bringing the heat with it. I walked back to her workstation and set a fresh cup of coffee next to her hand. Drink, I ordered, quietly. She looked up, blinking against the harsh workshop lights. I'm almost finished with the liability projections. The projections won't matter if you pass out, I said, leaning against the workbench. She took a sip of the coffee, leaning back in her chair. She looked at the massive acrylic tank I was building. It's beautiful, she said softly, in a brutally practical way. It's just dirt and water, I said. It's the truth, she corrected. She looked at me. The professional distance, completely gone. Peter used to be my mentor. You know, when my father was alive, Peter taught me how to read an amortization schedule. I trusted him. People who only read schedules usually miss the foundation, I said. I wanted to reach out and touch her shoulder, to offer a physical anchor against the betrayal she was feeling. I kept my hands in my pockets. The restraint was a conscious, heavy choice. I wasn't going to blur the lines when she was already fighting a war. I'm glad you were at the gala, Rowdy, she said, her voice quiet. I'm glad the valet lost your car, I replied. She smiled, a small, tired expression, and turned back to her laptop. At 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, my phone rang. It was Audrey Baker, Margot's chief operating officer. Margot answered it on speaker. Margot. Audrey's voice was tight with panic. Peter pulled a procedural maneuver. He convinced the chairman that the impending storm requires an accelerated decision to secure contractors. The board vote isn't tomorrow morning. It's tonight. Sunday evening at 6 p.m. The deadline hadn't just moved. It had vanished. Understood, Audrey, Margot said, her voice terrifyingly calm. She hung up the phone. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She looked at me. Is the model ready? It's ready, I said. Sunday evening, the executive boardroom on the top floor of the Gutierrez building was a theater of corporate anxiety. The storm was still lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Peter Williams stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. He was holding court, his voice soothing and entirely reasonable. It brings me no joy to rush this process, Peter told the 7 board members, leaning forward, resting his hands on the table. But the weather dictates our timeline. Margot's design is brilliant. Truly, but it is an artistic indulgence. My value-engineered proposal cuts excavation costs by 20%. It is lean, objective, and financially responsible. I move for an immediate vote to award the Viridian contract to my division. Chairman Sanders, an older man with sharp eyes, nodded slowly. The savings are substantial, Peter. In this economic climate, fiscal responsibility must lead. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Margot walked in. She was wearing a sharp, flawless navy suit. She didn't look tired. She looked lethal. I walked in right behind her. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was wearing my work boots, dark jeans, and a canvas jacket. I was pushing a heavy, steel utility cart. On top of the cart was the 4-foot acrylic tank, covered by a black tarp. Fiscal responsibility only works if the math is based on reality, Peter, Margot said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the large room. She walked to the opposite end of the table and set her leather briefcase down. Peter offered a condescending smile. Margot, dear, the numbers have been vetted. Your numbers were vetted using preliminary, incomplete data that you unlawfully extracted from my division's server, Margot stated, not raising her voice, but letting the accusation land like a hammer. The boardroom went dead silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably. That is a severe and baseless accusation, Peter said, his smile vanishing, his posture stiffening. It's entirely based, Margot countered smoothly. She opened her briefcase and slid a stack of stapled packets down the polished wood table. Those are the IT server logs, showing your secure login downloading my CAD files last Tuesday at 2 a.m. But I'm not here to debate corporate espionage. I'm here to save this firm from a $50 million disaster. She looked at me. I stepped forward, grabbing the edge of the black tarp. I pulled it back in one swift motion, revealing the physical model. The board members leaned forward, staring at the cross-section of earth, stone, and the carved trenches. Mr. Scott, Margot said, commanding the room perfectly. Would you explain the geography? Peter's design relies on a standard 14-foot trench system for storm runoff, I said, my voice flat and completely devoid of corporate polish. I pointed to the model. He based this on a preliminary survey that assumed the soil composition was uniform clay and gravel. It isn't. I reached into the utility cart and pulled out a massive, solid cylinder of gray granite. It weighed 40 pounds. I walked over to the mahogany table and dropped it right in front of Peter. It hit the wood with a violent, heavy thud that made the chairman flinch. That is a core sample I pulled from the southern quadrant of the Viridian site yesterday, I stated, staring Peter down. 12 feet below the surface, the entire quadrant sits on a solid, impermeable shelf of granite. Your trenches call for a 14-foot dig. Peter stared at the rock. The color began to drain from his face. You can't dig trenches in granite with a backhoe, Peter, I continued, the facts cutting through his rhetoric like a knife. You have to blast. That requires federal environmental permits and millions of dollars in explosives, which you didn't budget for. We can adjust the depth, Peter stammered, trying to recover his poise. We can run shallow trenches. Value engineering is an adaptive process. Let's adapt, then, Margot said quietly. She walked over to the utility cart, picked up a large jug of blue-dyed water, and poured it into the top of the acrylic model. We all watched as the water hit the shallow trenches I had carved above the granite shelf. The water filled the trenches instantly. Because the granite below couldn't absorb the moisture, the water had nowhere to go but up. Within seconds, the blue water overflowed the trenches, flooding the miniature landscape, pooling over the designated building zones. If you run shallow trenches, Peter, Margot said, her voice echoing in the silent room, the Viridian site floods during the first major storm. The entire corporate park becomes a toxic swamp. The insurance liability alone would bankrupt this firm. She looked directly at Chairman Sanders. Peter didn't engineer value, Richard. He engineered a catastrophe because he was too arrogant to verify the ground he was standing on. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The sound of the real storm outside seemed to amplify against the glass. Peter stared at the flooded model, then down at the solid rock on the table. The calm, mentoring facade shattered completely. He looked at the board members, seeking an ally, but they were looking at the water. They were looking at the undeniable, physical truth. "I withdraw my motion," Peter whispered, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't look at Margot. He couldn't. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving a vacuum in his wake. Chairman Sanders cleared his throat, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. He looked at the rock, then at Margot. "Well, it appears the alternative proposal is fundamentally flawed. Margot, does your original design account for this subterranean issue? My design routes the primary drainage along the natural bedrock decline, utilizing an elevated retention system," Margot said, her authority absolute. "It requires no blasting and fully mitigates flood risk. Then I move we award the Viridian contract to Margot's division," Sanders said, raising his hand. The vote was unanimous. The meeting adjourned 10 minutes later. When the room cleared, Margot remained at the head of the table. The tension in her shoulders finally uncoiled. She looked at the flooded acrylic tank, then down at the granite core sitting on the polished wood. "We won," she said quietly, stating it as a fact, not a question. "You won," I corrected, leaning against the wall and crossing my arms. "You built the trap perfectly." "I needed the rock," she said, looking up at me. "I needed you." She stood up, walked around the massive table, and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. She didn't offer a dramatic hug. The mutual respect between us was a tangible, heavy weight in the room, stronger than any desperate embrace. "I'm restructuring the leadership team for the Viridian project," she said, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "I want you to run the physical site, not as a subordinate contractor." "I'm a landscape architect, Margot," I reminded her. "You're the only person who actually understands the foundation," she corrected smoothly. "I want you as the co-director of the project." "That's a massive jump in title," I warned her, my practical mind automatically running the optics. "The board will say, you're playing favorites. They'll talk. Let them talk," she replied instantly, setting a hard boundary right in front of me. "This is my choice. You earned it. Unless you don't want to work with me?" I looked at her. I looked at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the resilience that had survived a brutal corporate sabotage, and the quiet vulnerability she had shown me in the cab of my truck. I knew exactly what I wanted. "I'll take the title," I said, my voice dropping, the professional distance finally melting away. "On one condition," her eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "You're negotiating terms already?" "I am," I said. I pulled my keys out of my pocket and set them on the edge of the utility cart between us. "My condition is that tonight, we don't look at another spreadsheet. We leave this building, and I drive you home again. And we take the long way." It was a boundary. A promise to separate the work from the reality. She looked at the keys, then back up at me. She reached out, her fingers brushing the back of my hand as she rested her palm on the edge of the cart. The brief contact was electric. A quiet acknowledgement of everything we hadn't said yet. "I accept those terms, Rowdy," she said softly. 2 weeks later, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds over the Viridian megasite. The massive expanse of Earth was loud with the sound of diesel engines and shouting crews moving dirt exactly where I told them to. I stood by the newly built site trailer, reviewing a clipboard of logistics, when a black car pulled up the dirt access road. Margot stepped out. She wore a sharp navy suit, looking every inch the newly confirmed CEO-elect. But the dark circles under her eyes were permanently gone. She looked rested. She looked happy. She walked straight over to me, holding 2 cups of black coffee. She handed me one without a word, a silent continuation of our routine. "The board members are arriving for the groundbreaking ceremony in 10 minutes, Margot said, leaning against the side of the trailer, completely unbothered by the construction dust on her suit. I wanted to check in with the co-director first. I took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. The grading is on schedule. We hit bedrock exactly where the map said we would. Everything is solid. She turned to face me, The press is going to ask who discovered the structural flaw in the old design. Tell them the firm's internal audit caught it, I said, preferring to stay out of the corporate spotlight. No, Margot said. She didn't smile. She just looked at me with a steady, quiet certainty. She reached out and adjusted the collar of my canvas work jacket, her knuckles brushing lightly against my neck. It was a small, proprietary gesture that spoke louder than any grand declaration. It was the physical proof that the professional lines we had drawn were gone. I'm going to introduce them to Rowdy Scott. She let her hand drop, her eyes holding mine for a long, heavy second before she turned to face the arriving cars. My partner. I took a breath of the cold morning air, looking at the woman who had fought a war and won, and who had chosen to stand next to me in the dirt. All right, I said, feeling the weight of the word settle right where it belonged. The end.